So Peter, take us through Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday night. I know one thing from dealing with you guys, you were certainly prepared for it.
Yeah, so we obviously knew that the storm was coming last week. So over the weekend we watched the track. Very happy that it was drifting west. Still had the gut feeling that we could have some damage. Any wind this time of year, lots of foliage on trees. So we expect the worst, and we plan for it. Monday we had our storm calls. By Tuesday we were ready to go. We had crews standing by and reconvening around 4 p.m. when everything sort of picked up. And that's when we started getting the bulk of our calls. And I would say we had maybe from 3 to 5 o'clock is when everything that could go wrong went wrong, which wasn't bad for us. At the peak, we had maybe 1,400 customers out. A bulk of that was one circuit that tripped. Likely something landed on it. We didn't actually find a branch on the line, but the entire circuit tripped, which took out lots of areas on Mount Hope Street, Town Street, John Reza, Clifton. That was back up around 9:30. So that entire circuit was back in. That means 1,300 customers back in power. After that, we were left with maybe 40 to 60 in a few different areas. We had some issues on Allen Avenue. We had some issues up on Payne Road. We had individual customers who have services ripped off their house. There's a different procedure for that. One, we safely disconnect the line, and then they need an electrician if their service is damaged, and if they call us back that evening, or whenever they call us back, we'll get power back to them, so we'll hook it up. I think we have one customer that's out right now who is still working with an electrician. But for the most part, we were well prepared, well positioned. We had initially had half our crews going to be standing by, and then we called them right back in. So some of them didn't even get a chance to go home, turn around the vehicles, and we were already in it. So I think we had one bad gust of wind, which also proved to hurt our building. So our skylight actually lifted up around 4:30. The whole building shook, and it was askew by about a foot. Water was pouring in, so quick action. A few of us got up on the roof, moved it back into position, secured it back down, just so we can prevent all that damage from coming in.
As if you didn't have enough to deal with already.
Right, that was probably the most exciting part in the office. Our field crews were fantastic. We got a lot of praise out there. When you lose power, it's always the question, well, when am I going to get it back on? And how do we evaluate that type of stuff? So we look at where we have outages. We get calls right now, and we rely on the calls. We are moving towards a future where we don't have to rely on just calls. We're moving towards a future where we have a system that tells us who's out before we get a call, and we can better prioritize and better respond to outages. And right now, we actually manually call back every single customer to make sure that they have power, because in some cases you get customers that aren't home, that don't know, and they can talk to their neighbors and things like that. Or you get customers that may have one house has an issue and they don't have power, but we restored the whole street, so they'll call us, we'll call them. There's a lot of communication that happens. Our customer service staff is downstairs, and we made calls all the way up until people basically said, I'm trying to sleep. So we'll do that. COVID hasn't helped. It certainly has made it an additional layer. There's a lot of the mask wearing going on, which we have to do. We have multiple groups of employees, A and B, cross-contamination of groups, if you would, so we keep groups separated. So adding the complexity of a pandemic response to a storm is always that double contingency that we talked about back in March, and here we are practicing it. It's never perfect, and we learn as we go. What could we do better? Certainly, there are little areas that we are doing an after-action review that we can discover if we can do better. Of course we can on certain things. It's always customer expectations, and we are the local utility, so we work for you. And we want to make sure that we get power back on as fast as possible, and we do that with a total of under 40 employees. So thank you for your patience as we attack these storms. If we have a much bigger event, it just equals longer outages. But for us, we were restored in less than 8 hours.
This may sound like a stupid question. You mentioned that the majority of the people who lost power was because of one circuit. You couldn't find a tree limb on lines or whatever. That being the case, how do you know exactly where the repair needs to be made?
So in that case, what happens at the substation, where the power is actually delivered out, the circuit runs a few miles, breaker opens just like a breaker would trip in your house, and if you can't find why the breaker tripped in your house, you go to the circuit panel, you flip it back on. If it doesn't trip again, you know you're good. Essentially what happens here, we'll go to the substation, everything looks clear after patrol, try it in. Flip the breaker, much bigger breaker, about yay big and yay tall, makes a louder noise than the ones at home, but same idea. Energize it, if it holds, you're good to go, and that's what happened. So we do reasonable checks, we do our diligence to make sure that everything is safe to go. We'll patrol the main line, see if there's any cutouts, which is basically a big fuse that's mounted on a pole. In some cases, it's obvious. There's a giant tree that cut things in half. You got 3 poles down and wires on the ground. Well, that's an easy one to figure out and diagnose. So we can isolate those types of areas. This one we got lucky, got it back up, and that was our biggest outage. Once that was in, our call volume dropped to a few calls every 15 minutes or so.
Not to compare North Attleboro Electric with National Grid, but I'm going to do so.
Sure.
You seem very proactive as far as tree trimming, trees that are hanging over lines, being proactive as opposed to being reactive. Had that not been the case, my guess is the number would have been much higher than 1,400.
Yeah, and I want to get that number lower. That's always the goal, is to drive that down to as low as possible. So we had 2 tree tech crews on with us as part of our arrangement with tree trimming in general on an annual basis. We do tree trimming. It's our take, and through the last few years of research, we don't do enough tree trimming. Tree trimming is always something that it's expensive. It's a pure maintenance item. What you're doing is just clearing things back and opening the envelope around your lines. Cut back as much as we can reasonably. Of course, you don't want to damage trees. We do take into account public shade trees and lots of other private property trees. People are very sensitive to their shade and things like that. We understand when the power goes out, though, the attitude can change, saying, take this tree away, I don't ever want it again. So it's that balance. But yes, we are very proactive. We're on a 5-year cycle, and we're going to be moving to a 3-year cycle in the near future to help cut the foliage back. That is the #1 cause of outages for us. It's tree damage.